Hello, my name is Melissa Day, and today I'm going to talk to you about the theorist Paulo Freire and how his research has influenced the early childhood classroom. So who was Paulo Freire? Paulo was born in 1921 and died in 1997. He was born in Recife, Brazil. The importance of Recife, Brazil is that it's in the northeastern part of Brazil where indigenous people lived. It was the first region that was colonized by the Portuguese and the first to receive African slaves. Paulo Freire grew up in an educated middle-class family. He would describe his childhood as a happy childhood. However, since he was alive during the Great Depression, he has experienced poverty and hunger. Paulo Freire was a Portuguese teacher in a secondary classroom. He then became a history and philosophy of education professor. He was imprisoned and exiled in 1964 for subversive teaching elements. He returned to Brazil in 1979. His literacy projects from 1979 to 1985, and then he became the Secretary of Education in Sao Paulo in 1988. He continued critical and intellectual and activist work, and then, of course, passed away in 1997. Some of the theories of Paulo Freire. In his book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, he discussed the dynamics between the oppressors and the oppressed. And I'm going to play a short clip of Bruno Damian Heinsfeld, who is a PhD student in interdisciplinary learning and teaching at UTSA. And she's going to talk to you about the concept of coincidência.
Hi, I'm Bruna Damiana Heinsfeld, and I'm a doctoral student in the Interdisciplinary Learning and Teaching program at UTSA. My peer Melissa invited me to talk to you a little bit about the idea of conscientização. According to Paulo Freire, conscientização is the awareness of a critical social consciousness. And this awareness is only possible through the development of a sense of identity. But more than just a reflection on some critical social issues, conscientização demands praxis, that is, action, ação. Without the willing to transform social reality and engage knowledge into this pursuit, there cannot be conscientização. And for each of us to develop this critical awareness, we must also be critical thinkers. We must become aware of our roles in society, even though sometimes as the oppressors. Conscientização is the path for a liberating education. But engaged and critical actions are indispensable. They are part of the genesis of this driving force that allows empowerment, emancipation, and the protagonism of each subject who is searching for liberation and transformation. Thank you.
Some other theories are problem-posing education, dialogue, literacy and storytelling, and critical pedagogy. So before we talk about problem-posing education, we're going to talk about the opposite, which would be considered the banking system, according to Paulo Freire. So here are some images of what the banking system looks like. We have children in seats and rows, and each teacher is dumping a different subject into the student's head as they passively learn. Here we have gas station where we're pouring knowledge into an empty head, shoving information in books into a child's head, and the idea of no dialogue. So here we have, hey Arnold, teaching the letter A for apple, and the student is passively collecting the information. So this is the assembly line of learning. So with problem posing education, we have the action, listening, and dialogue dynamic. In the early childhood classroom, we have Quintero talked about the stresses of the importance of problem posing education and storytelling, as well as bringing the students' cultures and languages. Erickson discusses the struggle of kinder teachers to push academics from state standards and how teachers resort back to the banking education. And they argue that developmentally appropriate practices promotes Freirean ideologies more than skill-based methods in teaching. I had the administrator that came in and asked students questions and got mimicking answers of what the teacher would want from the students. And by probing in small groups, the administrator was able to develop more authentic thinking and answers from students. And teachers and students learn more about each other in this situation. The next one we have is dialogue. So dialogue, you have the back and forth between the student and teacher. There's respect, equality, and then there's also change through dialogue. So dialogue cannot exist, however, in the absence of profound love in the world and for people. Dialogue in the early childhood classroom. Sykes links Reggio Emilia and knowing the child, developing quality conversations and dialogue. Kim uses dialogue to discuss gender roles in a Korean bilingual language school, where children and teachers were able to speak freely in English, Korean, and in a mixture of the two, and it maximized the participation. I discussed dialogue with students and administrators, listening and probing for authentic responses. Derman Sparks et al. Discuss a third space, and this happens whenever you enter into dialogue in a respectful manner. You're able to come up with an alternative solution to the issue. And also, they talked about the changing culture and community through dialogue. The next part of theory is the literacy and storytelling. Paulo Freire said that we needed to read our world before we read words. And this was done by creating an learning cycle done with adults in personal study. So even though the research I'm covering links early childhood education, Paulo Freire focused on adults. And then there was the discussion of the magic book, which was a book that was only pictures and no words. And it was about the parents reading the book to the child, even though there were no words. And each time the story was different, even though the pictures never changed. And through different situations, or whenever a child was retelling the story to somebody else, the story would change based on who the child was telling the story to. So in the early childhood classroom, literacy and storytelling, we have Cosette and Condi, where they talked about families can be a part of literacy and early reading, and they're reading the world instead of words. They focused on education in families and poverty and did research on how parents could be a part of literacy and early reading learning in their children. Erickson linked to developmentally appropriate practices and literacy standards and discusses Vivian Gusson Paley using storytelling in a developmentally appropriate way to promote literacy. Vivian Gusson Paley and Freire related storytelling to the child. Quintero discussed the storytelling links of school and home. Family plus culture plus storytelling equals richness. The use of stories is a vital construction for development and learning. Storytelling helps language development. Kim links stories to critical thinking, dialogue, and social justice from different viewpoints. This was done through stories like Cinderella, Snow White, and the Three Little Pigs, and critically thinking and discussing different perspectives of various characters. Critical pedagogy. This is participation, respect of knowledge, transformation, action, education can be used to transform our world and liberate the oppressed. Advocacy and change through education and action. Critical pedagogy in early childhood. Quintero talks about agency used while writing stories to imagine a better world. Interdisciplinary form of teaching, critical theory and critical literacy by use of storytelling. Quote, critical literacy as a process of constructing and critically using language, oral and written, as a means of expressing, interpreting, and or transforming our lives and the lives of those around us, end quote. Erickson again talks about developmentally appropriate practices and state standards and calls for action and advocacy. Derman Sparks discusses systematic change with the third space, fosters open communication, and quote, an anti-bias early childhood care and education program puts diversity and equity goals at the center of all aspects of its organization and daily life, end quote. So education is not neutral. And to quote Freire, washing one's hands of a conflict between the powerful and the powerless means to side with the powerful, not to be neutral. Education is not neutral. So I will leave you here and ask each and every one of you to figure out how you can make a change in the world and advocate for our children. Thank you for watching and have a wonderful day.